Syed Najmuddin Hashim. I'm about 72 now.
And at the time of Direct Action Day, you were a student in Calcutta.
I was a student of Presidency College, Calcutta, and also working part-time in the daily morning news.
To most people, the violence that followed Direct Action Day came as a surprise. Was it a surprise to you? Did you see anything that might have been leading up to it?
No, it wasn't a surprise, and those who say that it was a surprise to them, I think they are being not quite honest, because a lot of violent speeches, incitements had been going on for quite some time, you see.
By whom?
By basically the Muslim League, because, you know, they if you go back a bit, when the 37 elections took place and Congress swept all the general seats, which means the non-Muslim seats, and the Muslim League took the bulk of the Muslim seats, the Congress had formed governments in 7 provinces, and they were a very successful administration. But then when the war came and the British committed India to the war effort without consulting the Indian leadership, they took serious exception, and they wanted to know the war aims of the British, whether it included freedom after and they were wanting an interim national government. The British were not forthcoming, so they resigned on a particular date. I forget the 39, I think. Yes, the war started in 39. So Mr. Jinnah organized a deliverance day, throughout India. That was the first tangible that Muslims, and he declared as much, saying that Muslims cannot expect justice or peace under Congress government.
But in the run-up to Direct Action Day, did you see any sign that the Muslim League was preparing for fighting?
No, that I would not say, because, there were certain areas which specialized in this sort of thing. I did not see any preparations on the Hindu side either, but there were preparations on both sides, because all the talk, all the rhetoric was very violent. That the Muslim League slogan was that we'll fight to get Pakistan. And there was no question, the word was not struggle or movement, but fight, And when you use such terms, the untutored, which in the slum dwellers, these were the main supporters of the Muslim League. The middle class were brought in because of the sort of mass contacts which Abul Hashim did. I would give, and Mujib was one of Abul Hashim's close people, and Bhashani had not yet come into the picture in a big way. That came later on after the Assam movement, when they started throwing out. But Mujib was midway, but he was definitely anti-feudal, anti-Nazimuddin and others, who were the landlord class, Ispahanis, and with Abul Hashim and Suhrawardy, you could say.
But who from the Muslim League side actually did the fighting? Was this the student?
No, not the students. It was these people from the slums who were professionally, many of them were butchers and things like that. There's an entire class of lumpen proletariat, you can say, who were cultivated by Suhrawardy in particular. They were Suhrawardis. Suhrawardy hardly spoke Bengali.
The chief minister?
The chief minister at that time. And he was called the prime minister. That correction I must make. Even after partition, East Pakistan, Nurul Amin was the prime minister. They became chief minister when the merger, when the one unit came and East Pakistan and West Pakistan came. Then formerly it was East Bengal and the prime minister of East Bengal. So right after Nurul Amin's time. Suhrawardy was the prime minister of Bengal.
But he
Premier.
He encouraged
Oh yes, he had his, that was the part of his politics, because the feudal class from this man from East Bengal, from the Nawab family, Khaja Nazimuddin, he was at sea in Calcutta. He did not have that. He was strong within the party, middle class politics. But if one had to call up forces, Suhrawardy was unbeatable in Calcutta. He was a product of Calcutta, and though he was highly educated, comes from a very good family, but they had this thing of having as their reserve force the real slum dwellers of Calcutta.
And people like Mr. Ajmeri and the National Guard.
They were the sort of polished version. They used to lead. Those were the foot soldiers. They were put in the Muslim League, green caps, but very few, educated people joined the National Guards. It was a sort of, it was to be looked down upon even by the Muslim Leaguers, as a thing that's not done for the Bhadralok, the gentleman class. Ajmeri was an exception, I should say.
So say that again.
It's a sort of, anti-Bhadralok, which is the gentleman class. It's not something not done. You may be very violent in your rhetoric, you may hate the Hindu, but you just don't take out a dagger and, kill a Hindu. That sort of attitude was prevalent in the middle class, lower middle class. But these were...
But how then did Mr. Ajmeri get involved?
That was a shortcut to, through the process of politics, there were such people were not able to make much headway, because those others who were student leaders and things like that, who were in the universities, in the colleges, that was a clientele which they did not know how to deal with. But they knew the Calcutta crowd, they could go into some speak in Urdu. They are basically all were Urdu speaking people, including Suhrawardy. Suhrawardy's Bengali was, almost as bad as Khaja Nazimuddin's, you see.
But would it be fair to say that Ajmeri was a Muslim then?
No, I would not say that, because, it is a sort of chameleon-like existence that Suhrawardy and people like Ajmeri had. Suhrawardy, while on the street, during a campaign, and then in the club, were two different persons, and they could switch like that, you see. And Suhrawardy, I remember during the United Front elections, 6 days growth of beard, unkempt and torn, and that same evening in the Dhaka club, he was dancing throughout the night and swilling whiskey, the best. So this he was there, and the National Guard more or less was a sort of counter, sort of, you can say, to Subhash Bose's forward bloc. They also had this militaristic. And basically, Jinnah was not a man who had much time for this National Guard and this and that. He used to play politics like a chess player, you see, having come in. Even Fazlul Haq's populist slogans, his way of going to the people was disliked very much by Jinnah. And that, I think, is one of the basic elements which led to that clash. Fazlul Haq, whenever, was defeated in court intrigues, would go to the people straight away, instinctively. And his slogan was one of the lasting slogans which even Mujib used, which Sheikh Hasina is using, about dal bhat, assuring lentil soup and rice to the ordinary man, 3 square meals a day. That was coined by A.K. Fazlul Haq. He had this populist.
A bit like Roti Kapre Makan.
And Roti Kapre Makan, and actually his clash, even his speeches were directed against these titled fellows, these Nawabs, these Khajas. And I remember at one speech he gave, was that I cannot sit in this parliamentary selection committee because 11 of them come from Isfahan, Khorasan, Samarkand, etc., etc. They are not Bengalis. So I cannot sit in a palaver with them. And then they are the landlords, the capitalists. They will join hands against me with the Hindu capitalists, you see. So, I mean, he was a terrific mass speaker, and he was a man of the people, which none of these Jinnah or Najmuddin and the rest were not, you see. Abul Hashim, though he was practically blind, had this charisma. He was a very good speaker that runs in the family. His father was also a very good speaker, Abul Qasim. So they joined hands, and Suhrawardy was a terrific campaigner. And I should say that 1946 Muslim League victory, Jinnah had very little to do with it. Jinnah's speeches were dry as dust and nobody was impressed. But Suhrawardy carried it to the village. Suhrawardy plus Hashim, Abul Hashim.
As far as the violence that broke out in Direct Action Day, the Calcutta killings are concerned, you're saying that basically the major part of the blame for instigating that lies with the Muslim League?
Yes, of course. There is no doubt about it, because as I said, the Deliverance Day in 1939, and then 46 Direct Action Day, it was not against the occupying power. It was directly directed against the Congress and the Hindus. And the Hindus took countermeasures. The Hindu Mahasabha under Shama Prasad Mukherjee, they took note. They had these, athletic clubs. On their side, it was not the lower classes who fought. It was the middle class who were trained in these athletic clubs which dotted throughout. And that was also a defense mechanism, because there was a theory which we saw during our student days that a Muslim with a knife, they were mortally afraid that it slaughtered the whole crowd. So they took this measure of building up muscle power, but they came from the Bhadralok class, mostly.
The upper middle class?
The lower middle class, you can say middle class, and they were not the sort of shock troops who constituted the main rioting on the Muslim side.
What did you see of the rioting?
Rioting, you see, one thing was that it would not have achieved such serious proportions if the Bengal government had not declared a public holiday, you see, which was objected to strenuously by the Congress and others. And so it was a sort of free, and we started hearing from the morning about the huge processions, and we could see. I was next to the Maidan. There was, you are familiar with Calcutta, Dharmatala Street, through which you go from Wellington Square, following the tram line to Chowringhee and onwards to, of course, all the names have changed, but I was in that Wach al Mullah mansion. There was the big department store. The Muslims had opened that first department store. And on the first floor, there was a big veranda where we stood and we were watching all these we coming in. And most of the people obviously showed signs of being intoxicated, whether with alcohol or with, I don't know, with the enthusiasm. So they were making very wild slogans of fight will grab, will create out of our own strength, and the slogans were to the famous warrior Khalifa Hazrat Ali. He is. I mean that also in the Indo-Pakistan war also Hazrat Ali was always invoked. So Hazrat Ali was there, and they carried huge portraits, imaginary portraits of Jinnah, in battle dress with riding on a white horse and a scimitar at the side, and leading the battle of the hordes against the infidels. That sort of atmosphere was there. And the first victim I saw was a poor Oriya porter, Hindu, who he hadn't got a clue. He had his basket which he generally carries things, and he had just come into this side street from Madden Street. There was a Madden Street, and there a Muslim in a lungi broke away from a procession with a iron rod and hit him on the head, you see. And the fellow was absolutely startled. I mean, it broke open easy, but then it sort of encouraged others also into joining there. So that was a very shocking thing. For the first time, we realized the proportions that it is going into.
You saw that?
We saw that the first casualty, and that was more or less a Muslim area, this and the Chandni Chowk area, and of course on that other side was the Anglo-Indian area, Park Street and others, which through which after 3 days of practically being locked up in that area without any food, all the food shops had closed, New Market had closed. So 3 days of unrestrained rioting and looting, in which the Anglo-Indians took a big part because nobody touched them. You see, I remember there was a very big musical shop called Dwarkins, and they brought pickups and telas and took away organs and pianos and and radiograms. There was also a jewellery shop, MB Sarkar's, which was looted. The first department store to be looted was right next to Wellington Square, the Kamalala stores. Then on Chowringhee Road there was this Kesidas sweetmeat shops, that was looted. All the liquor shops were looted, which were, there were chain of shops we used to sell under government license toddy shops, alcohol, but locally brewed alcohol. So that I suspect was quite liberally either supplied to them or I'm out of looted, because to sort of work up a courage. I mean, riots, Calcutta had not known riots like Dhaka. Dhaka, there was a distinct class which specialized in rioting, and that is one reason that I insisted on leaving Dhaka and going to Calcutta. There was no other reason. I should have gone to Dhaka University, but I said I will not study. I will not pursue my studies. That was an ultimatum to my father. And lo and behold, you see, there was, in Calcutta, there were two parallel movements. One was a tremendous upsurge of anti-British movements, The Indian National Army were being tried for treason, so that was one. Then the Royal Indian Navy mutiny in Bombay, which also embraced Karachi and Calcutta. Karachi, I remember when I went to serve there, they showed me the grammar school had taken a shell from a ship. And then in 11 districts, this Tebhaga movement was going on of the sharecroppers. But all of them, gradually it was apparent that though the newly legalized Communist Party were taking the lead, particularly I remember Attlee in Parliament said that it was the Communist Party which organized the naval mutiny and led it, you see. And Attlee was a very sober man, he would not give an A. And I think that fact also sort of telescoped the sort of shortened the time of liberation, because the British, the conservative Congress leadership, and of course the Muslim League, which was a thoroughly reactionary leadership, they did not want these movements and these movements to get out of hand, So they quickly, if you see the mutiny, naval mutiny, the statements at that time given, were very interesting. Sardar Patel roundly condemned it, that it has besmirched the face of the Congress. You see? Mahatma Gandhi said, trust the British and remove the barricades. Jinnah made a statement just like Patel. You know? So none of them wanted this sort of thing to happen. But and side by side, you know, whenever there was a big, the mutiny started, and the very next day in British Parliament they announced the coming of the cabinet mission. So I tie it with that. And the negative factor was that attempts at heightening the communal tension, which ultimately led to what the statesmen called the Great Calcutta Killing. And after 3 days, we went back through almost of the time walking through, you know, Christian and Anglo-Indian areas. We reached Park Circus, which was the Muslim area. And then we started getting alarming reports of, you know, Muslims being slaughtered in Hindu areas, Muslim families being trapped in pockets. So we organized almost without any police protection. We just got a van and put a big Red Cross, and some of us started getting reports. Where there was a government had opened a relief camp in Calcutta Maidan, but it was too far. But we were through our own sources, through relatives, that my sister is there, and so we started on this mercy mission, and that gave us an idea of the volume of the violence. I was a student of the Presidency College, so we went to College Street, and you know, at that time the College Street second-hand bookshops, there are the new books, there are prestigious booksellers, and on College Street there were scores and scores of second-hand bookshops, which was our mainstay, all of which were owned by Muslims. So when we went there, we saw a literal carnage, dead bodies lying piled up on both sides, men, women, children, you know, and all the books on the road, burned, gutted, you know. And of course nobody we could rescue from that area. But from other middle class areas like Kalighat, Bhawanipur, we were able to save quite a few, and we had opened a relief camp in Lady Brabourne College. It was vacated, and it was so there, and that is where I met Mujib on a similar mission. You know, they had come from Baker Hostel, and they said, "Now you go off. We take charge." You know, and I had a very interesting discussion on the. I had a sort of my first meeting was very unhappy, because he was telling me this usual story that it was the Hindus who attacked the Maidan. So I said, you are saying that hundreds of thousands of people attended, and it would be only a lunatic who could attack a public meeting, you know. They could attack, and I'm sure they attacked Muslim processions coming from different areas. But if you say that the Maidan gathering was attacked, I mean, that so we parted on that note till we met a number of years afterwards, after Pakistan came, you know.
Do you think it's fair to say that the Great Calcutta Killings made certain that partition would happen?
Yes, that was the aim of it. That was precisely the aim, that for one thing Mr. Jinnah knew that if Bengal remained whole, then his leadership would be challenged. Every challenge that came to him came from Fazlul Haq, from Suhrawardy, you know. And so he would like this thing to go. But remembering, the British also remembered the anti-partition movement, you know, you remember in the 30s, 1905 movement. And so, I mean, to make it, the Hindus had to ask for this partition. There was no, I mean, because from 6 years they annulled the partition, 1905 to 11. And in the Darbar, King George V had to come and declare this, to appease So they, for one thing was that Nazad Dibosh, which is the Deliverance Day in 39, which was the sort of, then they had a inquiry committee, I forget, there was a Nawab of Pipli, I think, Pipli report, of what the atrocities that the Congress had done. The Congress had put up a very fine record and had tremendously increased their membership during those 2 years, 37 to 39. So once this, as a result of direct action day, this thing happened, the Hindu middle class was convinced that it was not possible to live with the Muslims in the same way. That went a long way. Then again, when the constitutional talks were going up, the British at one stage said that you join the Constituent Assembly, then you join the interim government. And Jinnah said, no, I am not joining the interim government, but I'll join the Constituent Assembly, or something like that. I don't remember very precisely. And so he went ahead and called the Congress to form the interim government. I remember Rajendra Prasad became the Speaker and Nehru. And immediately another direct action call went up, which resulted in the Punjab riots. See? So, I mean, if convincing was needed for the Hindus and the Sikhs who were very much adamant against partition of India, that was, and there is a very pragmatic and eyewitness account by the Army General, the British Army General, you must have Dhaka, while memory serves, wasn't it? So that gives you quite an objective view of the situation. So,
but are you saying that the Calcutta killings basically made partition inevitable?
Inevitable.
Can you say that perhaps in your own words?
No, you see, there were a lot of opposition to partition from the part of the Hindu middle class, because it was their, Calcutta was their city. It was, and it was the hub of, I mean, if partition had not taken place, none of us would have, though we belong to East Bengal, would have left Calcutta. Because that is where the career is, that is where the intellectual activity is, And I have never got over that. And most of our generation have never got over that. I mean, people who have worked there or studied there. But the Hindus' morale was shattered by this bloodletting. And they became convinced that it was not possible to stay in the same with the Muslims, because and this, I think, was what was intended. It was not Suhrawardy's scheme. I think the mastermind was Jinnah, because he had ordered the direct action. It was not implementation Suhrawardy did, but just imagine, on the 16th of August he did it, and in April 47 he started a movement for United Bengal. I mean, who would believe him? See? And the Congress, that angrily rejecting the bulk of the Congress, only Subhash Bose's brother Sarad Bose was with him. It was a non-starter. No.
Let me just so I'm quite clear in my own mind. You're basically saying that the Calcutta killings made partition an inevitability.
Inevitability. There was, and without the riots, this would have been an open question, because nobody really. I mean, it was economically also not a very sound proposition to cut Calcutta away from its hinterland, from where all the raw materials came. And the raw material, we had to seek an alternate market. I mean, totally. Post-partition, there was a barrier there, and it was very bad for the East Pakistan economy. I mean, that we had to look for other markets for jute, and naturally was interrupted. All the communications were interrupted, and the book trade was interrupted, which damaged, which in retrospect, I think, was a calculated move to convert East Bengal into a colony of West Pakistan. You see, there was a report in the early days of Pakistan by Professor Colin Clark, an Australian, who, in a nutshell, said that the potential, East Pakistan or East Bengal had the nucleus of an industry. It had a very thriving textile industry. West Pakistan had only canals, and agriculture. So he said that East Bengal should concentrate on industrialization and West Pakistan on agriculture. So they just buried it, and Mr. Colin Clark was given the money to go home, So that was the first hint we had, and this building up of Karachi on the export. Even the earnings, the jute export earnings, they were shown on Karachi's account. It was not on Chittagong's account. So that is how the real transfer of resources started right from the beginning. And they knew that if they could not cut off Calcutta from East Bengal, then the strength through the Bengali language and literature would defeat all their designs. That was the... And I'm proud to say that I was involved in the first language movement in 1948, March,